In this lecture, you'll learn about storage capability profiles in the NetApp Virtual Storage Console. What storage capability profiles allow you to do is to specify the characteristics of the storage. So for example, you can specify whether it's going to use thick or thin provisioning, if you want deduplication and compression enabled, and also the QoS performance characteristics of that storage as well. So once you've got your profile created, you can then use this, and when you provision a data store using VSC, you can specify the profile that you want to use, and the storage will be configured with those characteristics. Also, after you've done that, when you provision a virtual machine, you can specify a profile there as well, and then the virtual machine will be deployed with that profile for its storage. So for example, maybe you've got one virtual machine that you want to have high performance and another virtual machine that only requires low performance. It makes it very easy to provision your virtual machines with the correct storage characteristics by using these profiles. When you do use them, you have everything set up ahead of time, and then when you provision your virtual machines, you just select it from a drop-down, so that gives you consistency and standardization, much less likely that you're going to run into any issues and have to troubleshoot later than if you were configuring this on a case-by-case, virtual machine by virtual machine basis. Okay, let's get into more details. First thing is a reminder that the NetApp VASA provider provides information to the vCenter server instance about the NetApp storage systems that are being used in the VMware environment. The VASA provider translates between NetApp and vSphere APIs, and also vCenter learns the capabilities of the storage via the VASA provider. So when you're configuring your storage capability profiles, that's where VSC knows, which is on the vCenter server, knows the capability of the storage. It's going to get that information from the VASA provider. So for your storage capability profiles to be available to you, you need to make sure that the VASA provider is enabled, which it is by default in the latest versions of VSC. Okay, so when the VASA provider is enabled, you can define a set of capabilities for the storage. To get to this page, you go to the VSC plugin in your vSphere client. There's a page there for storage capability profiles. And you can see in the screenshot here that I'm creating a new storage capability profile. So I've said I'm creating a new one. I've just given it a name here, and then I would click Next. And then on the next page, you specify the platform. So you see, as we go through the different pages, you're specifying the characteristics or the capabilities of the storage. On the platform page, you specify whether this is AFF or a FAS system. Then the next page is performance. And you see the options we've got here are none, a QoS policy group, and performance service level. So let me explain what the three different options there are on the next slide. So QoS policy group is traditional QoS with fixed minimum and maximum values. Performance service level is adaptive QoS with values per terabyte. If you want a reminder about how storage QoS works and the difference between traditional and adaptive QoS, go back to the earlier section about performance. We covered storage QoS there. So just so you know, QoS policy group, that is the traditional QoS with a fixed min and max value. Performance service level is adaptive QoS. For your storage capability profiles, traditional max IOPS are supported on traditional data stores on FAS. Traditional min and max IOPS are supported on traditional data stores on AFF. So traditional minimum on traditional data stores is only on AFF. It's not supported on FAS systems. You can only do max IOPS on FAS. Traditional min and max IOPS and adaptive QoS are supported on vVols. So adaptive QoS is only supported on vVols. It's not supported on traditional data stores. Okay, so those are the caveats and the limitations there. When applied on a traditional data store, min and max IOPS applies at the volume level. So it's going to be applied to all the virtual machines that are in that particular volume. When applied for a vvol data store, min and max IOPS applies to each data vvol, which is basically the VMDK file, so the virtual disk for the virtual machine. So I know we haven't covered vvols yet. That's going to be coming up later in this section. Basically, what vvols do is it gives you more granular management of the characteristics, the storage characteristics that are going to be applied to your virtual machines. So rather than everything being applied at the volume or the LUN level, if you're using a SAN protocol, you can actually get granular and have different settings at the virtual machine and the virtual machine's virtual disk level. Okay, so if we do choose the performance service level, which configures adaptive QoS, that aligns with the default adaptive QoS policy groups, which again we covered in the earlier lecture about storage QoS. You can choose the Platinum storage capability profile, which uses the extreme adaptive QoS level. You can choose the Gold SCP, which uses the performance level of adaptive QoS. Silver is the value level. And you can also select a storage capability profile of Bronze, which is none. And I've put a star on that. I'll explain why in a few slides' time. Okay, FAS systems only support Silver and Bronze. AFF support all 4 of the different levels. Okay, so when you create the storage capability profile, your options there are Platinum, Gold, Silver, or Bronze. For the QoS level, Platinum means it gets extreme adaptive QoS, Gold means it's performance adaptive QoS, Silver is value, and Bronze, we'll get to that in a minute, it's actually also value. So this is a slide that we covered earlier in that QoS lecture in the earlier section. So you can just see the different characteristics of the different adaptive QoS policy groups here. So with extreme, that gives expected IOPS per terabyte of 6144, performance is 2048, and value is 128. So extreme is suitable for low latency applications, performance is suitable for databases and hypervisors, value suitable for email, web, file shares, etc. And you can see the expected latency, like the ballpark figure that would be expected if you apply value, performance, or extreme. You remember with traditional QoS, it sets an absolute minimum and maximum value for the volume. And that's applied no matter how much space the actual volume takes up, the capacity of it. With adaptive QoS, it changes based on the size of the volume. So with adaptive QoS, these figures are per terabyte based on the capacity of the volume. If you're using adaptive QoS with vvols, then all vvols should have an adaptive QoS policy applied. This is because balanced placement is used for provisioning. When you've got a vvol data store, it can be made up of multiple different volumes. So when you provision a virtual machine into that vvol data store, balanced placement is going to decide which volume in that data store to place the vvols for this virtual machine. And balanced placement can make a better decision about which volume to use when it has full information about all existing vvols. Support for adaptive QoS in the storage capability profiles was released in ONTAP 9.4. So adaptive QoS has been around for longer than that, but for SCPs that came out in 9.4. Before 9.4, there was just traditional QoS available. The meaning of none on the performance page changed in ONTAP 9.4. Before 9.4, it set a traditional QoS policy with no limit. And from 9.4, it sets an adaptive QoS policy of value. So before I explain that, let's just go back to the page again and see what is available. So I'm going back to the performance page here. And on here, you see that you select one of the 3 values. You have to choose one of them, either none or QoS policy group, where you can set the traditional min and max IOPS, or performance service level, where from the drop down, you select an adaptive QoS level. Okay, so going back to the slide we were on again, which is here. The meaning of none, that first option changed in ONTAP 9.4. Before 9.4, when there was just traditional QoS available in your storage capability profiles, it set a traditional QoS policy with no limit. So that's very intuitive. That's what you would expect that it means. But from 9.4, what it actually does has changed. From 9.4, it sets an adaptive QoS policy of value, which is not really intuitive. The reason for this is because, as we were just saying on the previous slide, adaptive QoS should be set on all vvols so that balanced placement can make a better decision. So on all vvols, we do want to have an adaptive QoS policy applied. NetApp engineering decided that if somebody says none on the performance page, then they don't really care what performance that virtual machine gets. So the lowest adaptive QoS value of value is what is applied. An adaptive QoS policy of value, however, can limit performance down to 75 IOPS for small data stores below 1 terabytes. Because it's adaptive QoS, the amount of IOPS that the volume gets depends on the size of the volume. So if it's a very small volume, it can end up with very few IOPS, and obviously that can affect performance. So if you want to make sure that that does not happen, and you really do want no limit, then set a traditional QoS high max IOPS value. With your vvols, you can set the adaptive QoS value. You can also still set the traditional QoS value as well. So it doesn't have to be adaptive for vvols. It can also be traditional. For traditional data stores, it is traditional or nothing because adaptive is not supported on those. Okay, so that was the performance and the QoS settings. Moving on to the next page, which is the storage attributes. In here, you specify whether deduplication is enabled or not, whether compression is enabled or not, whether the space reserve is thin or thick provisioning, whether encryption is enabled or not, and also the fabric pool setting. We're going to get to fabric pool in a later section in the course. So those are your options for fast systems. With fast systems, fabric pool is grayed out. It's always going to be set to any, but you can specify the setting for the rest of them. If you set the platform type as AFF, then you're going to have different options here. The fields are the same, but what you can set has changed. So deduplication and compression are enabled by default, and you can't change that. The space reserve is going to be thin. You cannot set thick. Encryption, you can specify whether you want that to be enabled or not, and you do have the different options for fabric pool when you're using AFF. Okay, so that was all the different characteristics of the storage that we can set in the storage capability profile. There are 4 storage capability profiles built into the system by default after you install the VSC plugin. Those are Platinum, Gold, Silver, and Bronze. And as you saw earlier, they align with the default adaptive QoS policy groups. When you select Platinum, that's going to choose the Extreme Adaptive QoS policy group. When you select Gold, that's going to set performance. When you set Silver, that's going to set value. And Bronze from version 9.4 does also set value as well. AFF platforms are compatible with any of the 4 profiles. Fast platforms are limited to Bronze and Silver because they don't have enough performance to get up to the Gold and the Platinum level. Okay, so let's have a look at the settings in those default profiles. So for Platinum, the platform is going to be AFF, and the performance is Extreme. Deduplication and compression are enabled. Space reserve is thin. Encryption is turned off. And fabric pool is going to be set to any. Then for Gold, it's exactly the same settings, apart from the performance level is performance rather than Extreme. So those are the built-in profiles there for the AFF platform. You can also create your own custom profiles as well. So for example, if you wanted to turn encryption on, you could do that with a custom profile. Then Silver, if you choose the default storage capability profile of Silver, that is for the FAS platform, and deduplication and compression are turned off by default. Space reserve is thin, encryption is turned off, fabric pool is going to be any, and the performance service level is value. And if we have a look at bronze, you're going to see that performance is none, which ends up actually also setting the value of value as well. And the other settings are the same as they were for silver. So deduplication and compression are no, space reserve is thin, encryption is no, and the tiering policy for fabric pool is any. And again, if you wanted to, you could create your own custom profile if you wanted to enable deduplication and compression, for example. When you provision a data store through VSC. Okay, so up to this point in the slides, we've spoken about how to configure the storage capability profiles and what the different settings mean. Now we're getting to the point where we're going to actually use the profile. And what you can use the profile for is when you provision a data store on your ONTAP storage for VMware through VSC. So when you do that, there's a drop down to select the storage capability profile for the data store. And the data store will be created with the capabilities specified in the SCP. So if, for example, you provision an NFS traditional data store and you choose a storage capability profile where the space reserved is set to thin provisioning, then what's going to happen is on your ONTAP storage system, it's going to create a volume and it's going to enable NFS access to that volume, and it's going to be a thin provisioned volume, and that's going to be mounted as a data store for your ESXi clients. Talking about vVols, again, mentioned this earlier, but vVol data stores can span multiple volumes. So your traditional data stores are always going to be one volume. vVol data stores can be one volume or they can be multiple volumes. Multiple storage capability profiles can be selected when provisioning a vVol data store, and you can specify which volumes to create as part of a vVol data store and which storage capability profile to apply to each volume. So, for example, you could configure a vVol data store from the VSC. You could say that you want it to be made up of 4 volumes, and you could have 2 of the volumes with deduplication turned on, and you could have 2 of the volumes with deduplication turned off. When you provision that data store, you specify how many volumes you want it to be made up of, you specify the size you want the volumes to be, and you also specify the storage capability profile on the volumes too, and the different volumes can have a different profile. Okay, so that was for provisioning the data store on the ONTAP storage. Also, the storage capability profiles in VSC can be mapped to VM storage policies in vSphere for storage policy-based management. So up to this point, we were talking about getting our storage capability profile configured in VSC, and we could use it to provision our data store in the ONTAP storage. And at that point, we just needed VSC to be installed, and we also needed to have our storage capability profile in VSC. Now we're moving on to actually provisioning our virtual machines. And if you want to use the profile when you provision the virtual machine, you have another component, which is the VM storage policy. This is configured on a different page in the vSphere client than the storage capability profile is. So the storage capability profile is configured on the VSC plugin page. The VM storage policy is configured on the policies page in the vSphere client. The VASA provider translates between ONTAP APIs and VMware APIs. A VM storage policy should be created in vSphere for each storage capability profile, and it should reference the SCP by name. Okay, so when you provision the data store on your ONTAP storage, you can do that with the storage capability profile from VSC. But then later, when you provision your virtual machines onto those data stores, you can specify a profile there, but that uses the VM storage policy, which is on a different page, but it is directly mapped to the storage capability profile in VSC. So let's say that you're using the Platinum and Gold storage capability profiles. What you would do is you would go to the VM storage policies page in the vSphere client, and you would create 2 VM storage policies, also called Gold and Platinum. The Platinum one would map to the Platinum SCP, and the Gold one would map to the Gold SCP. So you have that one-to-one linkage there. So when you create a virtual machine, you can specify its vSphere VM storage policy, and a list of compatible traditional and vVol data stores to choose from will be shown. Whatever data stores you've got configured on the storage will be available as long as they are compatible. Once the virtual machine is provisioned, the VASA provider continues to check compliance, and an alarm is generated if the VM goes out of compliance. So, for example, let's say that we have got a couple of storage capability profiles in VSC. One of them has got high performance QoS and it's configured as thin provisioning. Another one, we'll call that the thin SCP. Another one is configured as low performance for the storage QoS and it's configured with thick provisioning. We'll call that the thick SCP. You would then go and create a couple of VM storage policies as well. You would call one thick, which would map to the thick SCP. You would call the other one thin, and that would map to the thin SCP. Then, when you provisioned a virtual machine, you would specify the VM storage policy that you wanted to use, either thick or thin. If you specified thin, then it would go into the thin data store. If you specified thick, it would go into the thick data store. So what this does is it makes it easy that when you're provisioning your virtual machines, you just click on the drop down for the VM storage policy and you can specify the storage capabilities for it there. Saves you having to do it on a one-to-one basis for each virtual machine. And different vVols of the same virtual machine can be assigned different SCPs. So with traditional data stores, you can still use your VM storage policies. And when you do that, it's going to go into the one volume for that particular data store. But if you choose a vVol data store, you can have multiple volumes there with different storage capabilities. And the different vVols, so the different virtual disks that make up that particular virtual machine, you can give them different capabilities if you wanted to. So for example, maybe you have got a database and one of the VMDK files for the database requires high performance, another one requires low performance. Well, you could put that virtual machine in the same vVol data store, and you could have one virtual disk with high performance, another virtual disk with low performance. Okay, so how do we create our storage capability profiles? You can use one of the default SCPs that you saw earlier, or you can create your own. You can create your own one from scratch. So you can go to the storage capability profile page and you can say add new, and then you will get that blank wizard and you can fill in all of the different capabilities yourself. Or you can clone and edit an existing default SCP or a custom one that you'd created earlier. You can also automatically generate a profile through VASA provider analysis of an existing traditional data store. So maybe you'd already configured traditional data stores. You saw how to do that earlier in this section, and you didn't have VSC installed in vSphere yet. And then later you install VSC and you want to start using storage capability profiles. You've also got the VASA provider enabled as well. But when you got to that point, you can use the VASA provider to scan the capabilities of your existing data stores, and it will automatically generate a storage capability profile based on that. So because you've got the VASA provider there, the vSphere client, it can query the ONTAP storage to find out the capabilities of the storage. For example, does it have deduplication enabled? Is it thin or thick provisioned, and so on? So it can query the capabilities of that data store, and then it can automatically generate a storage capability profile based on those discovered capabilities. So if you do have existing data stores, you'll typically use the VASA provider to automatically generate the storage capability profile. You can also manually map a storage capability profile to an existing traditional data store. So you could use one of the default profiles, or you could create your own custom profile, and then you could map that to an existing traditional data store. Now, if you did not configure the storage capability profile with matching settings for that data store, then you will get an alarm about that, because the VASA provider monitors data stores for compatibility with their SCP and generates an alarm if any are out of compliance. So if you did do a manual mapping and you got it wrong, you would get an alarm for that. Also, if you created a data store in VSC using a particular storage capability profile, and then an ONTAP administrator went and manually changed one of the settings, then you would get an alarm about that as well, because it would no longer be compliant. A data store can match multiple profiles, but can only be associated with one profile. And finally, let's summarize the policy-based management. So we spoke about this earlier in this lecture. There's two elements to policy-based management. There is vSphere's VM storage policy, which is under policies and profiles, and there's VSC's storage capability profiles. So the normal order of operations when you're using VSC is you will create the storage capability profile where you specify the characteristics that you want the storage to have. You will then use VSC to provision the data store, and when you provision the data store, you specify the storage capability profile you want to use so it gets those characteristics. Then you map the VSC storage capability profile to a VM storage policy. So you create a new VM storage policy, and when you do that, you specify the VSC storage capability profile that it is mapped to. So you've got that one-to-one relationship there. Then, when you provision your virtual machines, it's the VM storage policy that you select when you're provisioning the virtual machine, and then it will be put into the correct data store based on that. Okay. vSphere's VM storage policy references the VSC storage capability profile. Thanks for watching. If you want to get hands-on practice with NetApp storage for free on your laptop, then you can download my free ebook, which you can see above my head right now. Also, check out my NetApp Storage Complete course, which will teach you everything you could possibly want to know about ONTAP. Thanks.